year, I started learning Japanese more seriously, and I've also dabbled a bit in Hungarian as well. And since I've been at a higher level with my French and Korean for some time now, this is my first time in a long while really starting over from scratch. So I have the privilege of applying everything that I learned with my French and Korean through trial and error to my Japanese and Hungarian now. So I thought I would share with you guys my new and improved approach to learning a new language. Learning the alphabet. The first thing that I do when it comes to learning a new language is learning the writing system. So Japanese and Korean, for example, have their own writing system. So I would first start out by learning how to write in that writing system rather than relying on romanization. Even with a language like Hungarian, where they also use the same letters as English, you will find that the pronunciation of those letters could be very different. So first I start out by trying to learn what those differences are and getting familiar with how they should be pronounced in that language. I have personally found that Duolingo does a great job of this for Japanese and Korean, but for other languages, I feel like you can just YouTube them and find a lot of examples there. Listen to music or watch TV shows in that language. This sounds like such an unnecessary step that you wouldn't prioritize, but I find that if I have a lot of experience listening to the language before I formally start to study it, I tend to learn and progress a lot more quicker, especially when it comes to listening to music, because I find that I can look at the lyrics of a song and get a lot of practice listening to the song, reading along with the lyrics, and actually learning how to sing that song without actually knowing what it means. I find this much more beneficial when I then go to start studying the language because I already have a sense of how everything is supposed to sound, and then I feel like I don't have to think as hard about pronunciation because I've already been practicing the sounds through music. For example, Hungarian uses the same, Roman alphabet as English, but the pronunciation of a lot of these letters is so much different than what I was expecting that when it came time to study, it was really hard to try to learn Hungarian, but also remember these differences at the same time, and it was kind of like giving me a headache. But after taking a break and listening a lot to Hungarian music while reading the lyrics to the songs, I felt that I got much better at internalizing how things are supposed to sound, how they're supposed to be pronounced, that when I went back to studying, I was able to just read Hungarian, listen to Hungarian, and I didn't really have to think about that anymore. Also, I think if you listen to a lot of music, and especially if you watch a lot of TV shows or films in that language, it just builds a lot of curiosity and intrigue, which for me personally made me much more motivated to get started learning. Pick out a good comprehensive textbook. As a beginner in a new language, I still think it's really important to pick out a nice, comprehensive textbook that's going to get you through your beginner stages. But when it comes to choosing a textbook, I personally try to find textbooks that have much more of the target language in the book than it does English. And I also look for books that have a lot of reading passages and a lot of dialogues, as well as a lot of MP3 recordings for listening and shadowing practice. Because I really want to make sure that I'm not just getting like huge lists of words to memorize, but I actually want to see these new words that the textbook is presenting to me used in context through these leveled reading examples, through these leveled dialogues where I can see how it's used in context, in writing, in listening, and learn that way rather than through rote memorization. And I also want to be able to listen a lot to the language and be able to hear how these words are pronounced, not just in isolation, but in a sentence, because for many languages, how a word sounds by itself versus how people pronounce it in a sentence in different contexts, it can change, or the intonation can change. And I think it's really important to be exposed to that early on and to do a lot of listening and shadowing practice with that so that I can learn to internalize those patterns myself. Prioritize listening comprehension. Now, when it comes to learning a language, we have passive skills, which is reading and listening, and we have active skills, which is speaking and writing. Now, in my opinion, I think that listening and speaking takes precedent to reading and writing, because even in our native language, we essentially learn to listen and speak automatically, whereas reading and writing is something that we have to go to school and take formal lessons to learn and improve upon. And I always just try to remember that reading and writing is essentially man-made. So when it comes to learning a language, I think it's easier to learn to listen and to speak and prioritize conversing, because if you know the language, then it's easy to pick up reading and writing later, but I don't think that the opposite is true. So from the beginning, I feel like listening comprehension is essentially where language learning starts, so I make sure to get as much listening practice as I possibly can from the very beginning. So I do this through Duolingo, or honestly any resource that I have that has both a text and an audio component. I will make sure that I comprehend the text and that I practice listening to it and reading along over and over to the point that I can stop looking at the text itself and just listen to it and understand everything that's being said. Because if you don't get enough listening practice, later on you may find yourself feeling stuck, unable to understand what people are saying without subtitles. Shadowing as much as possible. Shadowing is not something that I did previously with my French and Korean. It's actually something that I kind of discovered quite later on, and as a result, I feel like it led to really big gaps in my abilities. But now I don't think that I could ever start learning a new language without doing a lot of shadowing practice from the beginning, because as I said, conversing, so listening and speaking a language, I think is really crucial to the learning process. For those of you who don't know, shadowing is essentially the process of listening to a native speaker say something in your target language and then trying to copy and repeat back everything that you heard down to the same pronunciation and intonation as that native speaker. Usually this is done with some sort of text or script of what's being said, and people will look and read along to that while they are copying the native speaker. And usually this is just done like one phrase or one sentence at a time. And I personally think shadowing really helps with your listening skills, your pronunciation, as well as your speaking skills, because while you are trying to listen to that native speaker in order to copy them, you're really listening hard for all of the smallest details of pronunciation, intonation, if there's certain like stresses in the sentence or periods where they draw things out for whatever reason, and even just to listen to where they take a natural pause so that you can also learn where you should be pausing in your sentences too. Then on top of that, you are also trying to practice saying what you've heard and practicing trying to copy that native pronunciation, intonation, all of those natural pauses. So you're also building muscle memory in your mouth, and you're essentially exercising your mouth, your tongue, whatever, those muscles in order to pronounce those more like a native speaker of that language. So that, in my opinion, also really helps with your pronunciation. And in general, I think when you're listening and copying what a native speaker is saying, you're also internalizing like sentence patterns, grammar, vocabulary through whatever they said, and you're really internalizing those patterns yourself that might come out later when you go to speak. If you want to learn more about shadowing, I actually recently made a video about how I go about shadowing in another language. So either you'll see like a link up here for that video, or if not, just go down into the description box and you'll see a link to that video. You guys can check it out as well. Practice with Duolingo. Now, I am not in any means saying that if you use Duolingo alone, you are going to master a language, but I'm just saying that I personally think that Duolingo is a great tool to add to your toolkit of different things that you can do to improve your language skills. I think Duolingo is a great place to get a lot of exposure to sentence patterns and internalize those sentence patterns, as well as learn a lot of new vocabulary in your target language. When I first started learning Japanese, I was using the Genki textbooks, and they essentially just have these giant word lists for you to rote memorize, which I don't personally agree with, but it was really boring and stale and really hard to actually retain any of the vocabulary I was learning from that textbook. But all of the words that I was exposed to on Duolingo for Japanese, I feel like were actually the ones that stuck. In my opinion, if you are using Duolingo, I think it's really important that you always do it with the sound on and focus on listening to what's being said, rather focusing entirely on reading. I think a big reason that Duolingo really worked for me was that I was listening to the language and I was listening to these sentences over and over. And when I was doing it at my house, I was also shadowing a lot of what I heard as well.
締め切りは何曜日ですか?
締め切りは何曜日ですか?
Make sure to do active practice. When it comes to learning a language, it is really too easy to just sit down, do a lot of listening practice, do a lot of reading practice, sit there at your desk, writing in a textbook, and totally skip the active part of language learning. Now, I do think it's really important to focus a lot on listening and reading comprehension in the very beginning and a lot of your passive skills, especially, in the beginning when you don't know enough of the language to really be conversational. I think there's nothing wrong with just totally focusing on your passive skills. But at some point, you do need to start making an effort to use the language more actively. Otherwise, one day you will find yourself in a situation where you feel like you can understand so much of your target language, but you can't speak it yourself. But something that I find that really helps you develop those active skills, no matter what level you're at, is to do a lot of writing practice in order to help you build that ability to produce the language. And just naturally, as you learn more vocabulary, you will then be able to also incorporate speaking practice as well. But I think that this step is really crucial. As a self-studier, I feel like, I don't have anyone to give me feedback and correct this, and I just find writing tedious and I didn't really want to do it. So it was really easy for me to skip it. But you really do need to practice these active skills, not just to get better at writing, but also to get better at speaking as well. And you don't need to write about the topics that are in your textbooks, guys, because honestly, a lot of the topics in there can be pretty boring. Try to make writing in your target language more fun by changing it to a topic that you actually care about. Think about things that you would want to talk about in your daily life and write about that. Imagine that these are conversations that you would have with someone, because that's actually going to help you be able to have those conversations later on. And just make sure that you get your writing proofread by someone, whether it's a friend, a teacher, and if you don't have either of those, which like I totally get on Hello Talk and get people to help you in exchange for you helping them, because it's totally free to do so, and you might make a friend in the process. But just remember, you need someone to give you feedback somehow, because otherwise you will just keep making the same mistakes.